Where are you from originally, and tell me a little bit about your growing up.
I grew up in Beaumont, Texas. Went to school through the Beaumont public school system. Graduated in 1970 from French High School in Beaumont.
So what universities did you attend?
I went to Lamar University for my BA and master's degree, and then it was North Texas State University at that point, and now it's the University of North Texas. Graduated with my PhD in 1979.
How did you become interested in cartography?
Really through the Garretts, to be perfectly honest. I use maps as a teaching tool, but only as a teaching tool, mainly as illustrations. And when I was first hired at UTA in 1986 as the Director of Special Collections, Mr. and Mrs. Gerald were in the midst of collecting maps. Really, the map collection was Mrs. Gerald's, but Mr. Gerald always said he was her assistant, first assistant. And so they introduced me to historical cartography. So that's really how I got interested, because I was working in special collections. They were donating materials to special collections. She was building a collection. She wanted to make sure whenever she purchased maps, we didn't already have it, because she didn't want to pay for something that ultimately was coming to UTA. So that's how I got interested in cartography.
What were your main research areas when you taught at UTA? What were your main research areas?
Well, I taught public history classes in oral history methods and methodology. I taught archival science, multiple classes in archival science, Texas history. I taught a couple of geography classes of the Southwest. So mainly either public history related classes are Southwestern/Texas history classes.
Some of those related to your experience as the Director of Special Collections.
I would say they all related to that experience as Director of Special Collections, yes.
So when you arrived at Special Collections, what were some things that you felt like you could make a difference in? How could you impact Special Collections?
When I arrived, what I thought Special Collection needed the most was processes. And that is, they had been pulled together over a period of about 15 years, various elements. There was a labor collection that became a part of Special Collections. Mr. Gerald had donated his initial collection in 1974 of about 10,000 Texana items. There was a university history archive as well. But none of these collections really interacted or integrated, and all of the processes were different. The labor process, the labor collection was processed differently than the manuscript collection. That was processed differently from the UTA archives. And I thought, this doesn't make any sense. We're all part of Special Collections. So really, what I decided that we needed most was procedures, and a common procedure to handle all types of collections basically the same way. Plus, libraries were digitizing at that point, and they were becoming electronic, and they were having these online systems. And if you didn't have, you and I were talking about it earlier, if you didn't have certain rules and regs, then it was not going to happen. And so it became pretty clear to me as soon as I got to UTA that that's what we really needed. We needed processing manuals, we needed templates on how best to do these things, and that's where I started. Yeah.
So at this time, the Virginia Garrett Cartographic History Library was already in place.
No, and let me kind of correct a misconception. The Cartographic History Library was in place.
Okay.
The Garretts were the chief drivers of starting a Cartographic History Library at UTA. And that happened in the mid-1970s, and it happened before I got here, but I've talked to the Garretts enough to know and read enough to know exactly how it happened. Mr. Gerald had donated his Texana collection in 1974, about 10,000 items, and in 1976, the Garretts were the drivers in raising money to purchase the maps from the Edward Eberstadt map, not just map collection, the Eberstadt collection of New York. It was the largest Western history collection probably in the world at that time. And it wasn't just maps. He had maps, but they had Texana, they had Western U.S., Trans-Mississippi West. And when John Jenkins, who was a very famous/infamous Texas book dealer, purchased the collections, they were book dealers, and Eberstadts were book dealers. But here you have this upstart Texan paid about $2 million to purchase this collection. He's going to turn around and sell it, which he did. And I'm talking about Johnny Jenkins now. And the Garretts felt that the map collection would be critical for special collections. So Mr. Garrett and the director of special collections at the time was J.C. Martin, and Mrs. Garrett were the impetus for going to the Sid Richardson Foundation in Fort Worth, the Brown and Lupton Foundation in Fort Worth. Mr. Garrett had just cycled off the Board of Regents, so they went to the UT System Board of Regents, got over $200,000 to purchase the Eberstadt map collection. And that's exactly what they did in 1976. And they actually had more money than necessary to purchase the collection because there were some duplicates that Special Collections already had. And when Mr. and Mrs. Garrett said they would return some money to the Richardson Foundation said, no, we're not set up to take money back. So you take that money and you go and purchase additional maps. And that's when they took J.C. Martin, who was head of Special Collections, to Europe, Amsterdam, Paris, Rome, London. And they frequented map places, bought maps to add to the new Cartographic History Library. 2 years later, UTA had agreed to build a facility on the 6th floor of the library for the cartographic maps. And so in '78, the facility opened. Mrs. Garrett didn't donate her maps until 1997.
I see.
So we had a cartographic history library, but it wasn't named the Virginia Garrett Cartographic History Library until she donated her 900 maps in 1997.
That makes sense. So in 1990, there was a gift of a number of atlases
That's
to
correct.
Special Collections.
Yeah.
What was that?
That was Mrs. Garrett's atlas collection. When she first started collecting maps and atlases, it was probably in the mid-1960s. It was when Mr. Garrett was very active in collecting Texana material and kind of as a form of self-defense. Mrs. Garrett, while he was in these, not just map places, but he was in bookstores, manuscript stores, she would kind of gravitate towards the maps. So he'd be looking at books and manuscripts and newspapers and broadsides and postcards and buying that stuff, while Mrs. Garrett started looking at maps because she told me that since she was a kid, she was born in 1920, and her father, when they would drive from Fort Worth to Marlin, which is in McLennan County, about 90 miles from Fort Worth, this was in the mid-20s, he would give her a map to look at. And she was always fascinated that somebody had put down on paper a route from Fort Worth. And she was a kid, 5, 6 years old. And that caught her interest, and it kind of maintained her interest. And maps are highly illustrative, as you know. Mm-hmm. And so maps have kind of an artistic bent to them, too. So Mrs. Garrett began looking at maps in the 1960s once, Mr. Garrett was collecting. And they caught her eye, they caught her attention, and she first started looking at maps that complemented his book collection and his manuscript collection, so maps that depicted Texas. But the more she found out about maps, and the more she found out how critically important they are, they're not just artistic devices, but they're sources that reflect kind of the culture, the science, the zeitgeist of the time period. And she really broadened her collection from just maps that show Texas as a political entity to maps that show what the land that would become Texas would be. And so she began collecting Gulf of Mexico maps. She began collecting maps of the Western Hemisphere and even some world maps because they all show the land that became Texas. So that's how, Mrs. Garrett kind of was the driver of maps, and that's how I got interested in maps. And she educated me, as did Mr. Garrett, about the importance of cartographic history.
Talk about how you became involved with them.
Well, it's when I was hired at UTA to become Director of Special Collections. Actually, it was just before that. During the interview process, it was a 2.5-day interview, which was long. Let's put it mildly. It was long, but you ended up talking with everybody, and a part of that process was going out to dinner with the Garretts, who were, as you know, the biggest donors that UT had, certainly up to that point. And Mr. Gerald wanted to know who was going to be head of special collections, so they took all of the candidates for the position out. And that's how I got to know the Garretts. And, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little surprised that they hired me.
Really?
Yeah, you never know. And they had 6 good candidates come to campus. I knew that. So, but we hit it off right away. And I think we had common interests. Mr. Gerald and Mrs. Gerald were both Texans. I was a Texan. We could speak the same language. And I'd always heard of the Garretts, but I had never met them before, because I knew what was happening at UTA. I just had never met them. So that's how I got involved.
What do you think set you apart as a candidate?
I have no clue. I really had no clue on what set me apart as a candidate. I knew some of the people, and actually have worked with some of the people who were vying for the same position since then, and I've done a book with one of them. So I don't know. He became head of special collections in Corpus Christi. So I don't know what set me apart, to be honest. It was a fun interview, though, and I was open about what I knew, and I was open about what I didn't know, and you had to make presentations to the library staff.
What had you been doing prior to that?
I was a public historian in Dallas. I was an oral historian. And that's exactly...
Working for the city of Dallas.
Yeah, working for the city of Dallas. And interviewing people and working at the Dallas Public Library and their Texas division, working a reference desk, doing oral history projects, doing archival projects.
That's a big step, though, from being an oral historian to now head of special collections in the UT system.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's why I don't know what they saw in me, to be honest. But one of the archivists of special collections, her name was Marcelle Hull, had worked with me in Dallas. She'd been an archivist in Dallas at the same division I was in, and then she was hired at UTA. And then when this job came open, she called me one night at the house, and she said, "Gerald, there's a job open at UTA that you need to apply for because I think you'd be great at it." I said, "Oh, Marcelle, I don't have the experience." And she said, "Just apply for it and just let it see what happens." And, after that 2.5-day experience, and I became the leading candidate, then the director of the library at that time visited me in Dallas because he wanted to see the people I worked with. There's one thing to look good in an interview. There's another thing to have your colleagues and your supervisors and all of that talk with the person who's going to hire you. So he came and spent the afternoon in Dallas, meeting with all of my supervisors, the people I worked with, and asking them questions about, what is it about this Saxon guy? Should I hire him or not hire him? It was kind of interesting. During one of my interviews with him, I asked, "Well, what exactly are you looking for at UTA?" And he looked me square in the face. He said, "Gerald, what I'm looking for doesn't exist." So I guess I was close to what he was looking for.
I guess so.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that 1997 donation that the Garretts made, Virginia Gerald made. Talk a little bit about that.
All right, let me go back and hit the 1990 donation because you did mention the atlases.
Yes.
And I think I talked around it. She had collected about 400 atlases, and all an atlas is a book of maps, generally speaking, of the world, not always of the world, but most of her atlas collection was world atlases. Most of them were from the 1800s and the 1900s, though there were some early ones, and there was an Ogilvy atlas from the 1600s of America, the Americas, which is a beautiful atlas, and it's probably the most valuable atlas that she had in her collection. But Mrs. Gerald was in the process of trying to decide, am I going to donate this material now or not? And the one thing you know about atlases is they're huge. They're huge books. They were running out of space at the Gerald Library. And when I say the Gerald Library, I mean their personal library at home. And so I think she was convinced that she was going to donate those to UTA, and that was 1990. Of course, they always knew the stuff was coming to UT. I say they always knew. Certainly Mr. Garrett always felt that, they were collecting, but not collecting for themselves. They were collecting for a higher purpose, and that was for other people to use it. And so even though he donated his collection in 1974, he continued to collect for UTA, and he continued to buy, and he continued to give, just as Mrs. Garrett was still collecting, but she was adding to her private collection at that point. But even by 1986, when I came to the library, I pretty much knew their collection was coming because she would keep calling. Well, I'm looking at this map. I may be in Paris. I'm looking do you have it? Well, let us check, and then get back with her and say either yes, we have it, or no, we don't have it. And if it's a yes, we have it, then she wouldn't buy it. If it's a no, then she would buy it. So that pretty much convinced me that sure, those collections are coming to us at some point. And Mr. Garrett always said, I did several oral history interviews with him in the 90s, early 90s. He said on the QT, Gerald, you guys are going to get Virginia's collections. It's just, we're still collecting. She's still having fun doing this stuff. And so just be patient. And that's what we did. So
why UTA, though?
Well, you have to know something about Mr. Garrett's background. Mr. Garrett went to the University of Texas. His father, before him, who was a minister, but before his father was a minister, was a lawyer. And he was a successful lawyer in Caldwell, Texas, which is a little town in Burleson County between, let's say, Texas A&M and UT Austin. So between Austin and College Station. And his dad was a very successful lawyer, but had a calling to the ministry and also had a breakdown. Mr. Garrett said he had a breakdown, and he always wanted to go into the ministry, but when he was growing up, I'm talking about Mr. Garrett's father. Mr. Garrett was born in 1914, so his father obviously much older than that. When he was growing up, the ministers would come through town. They would have to stay in people's houses, and they depended on people for their support. And Mr. Garrett's father, Jesse Garrett, didn't want to do that. He didn't want to have to depend on people to support him. And so he went into the law, and he went to the University of Texas. He didn't graduate with a law degree, but he read law. I think he was there a couple of years, and then read law and passed the bar and was a successful attorney until he had this breakdown. And he felt called to the ministry and ended up going to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, became the pastor of Rosen Heights Baptist Church. But it's that UT background. And when Mr. Garrett was growing up, and I said he was born in 1914, he told me that whenever people asked him what he wanted to do, he'd always say, I want to be a lawyer, and I want to go to the University of Texas. So that's how he ended up going to the University of Texas. And he enrolled in 1931 and was on a 6-year program where he received a bachelor's degree in, I think, liberal arts, and then a bachelor in law at the University of Texas. And then that was in 1937 he graduated. And then 37 he went to Harvard Law School for a master's in law. And that took him about 18 months. And, by that time he's back in Texas. So his blood bled orange. He loved the University of Texas. He ended up on the Board of Regents of the University of Texas. When he was a student, he was president of the Student Association. He was in the Tejas Club. He was, active in the Baptist Student Center. He was on the debate team. And he was literally involved in everything. And I mentioned he was on the Board of Regents from the late 60s into the 1970s. He was a distinguished alum from the University of Texas. I know that because I wrote his application. So we went to see him feted with all the other distinguished alums, and I tell you, they have some pretty high-powered distinguished alums from the University of Texas. And so that's how he ended up at UT, and that's how his stuff ended up at UTA.
But UTA is not UT Austin.
No, it's not. And, he told me he had kind of a crisis of conscience at one point. Would you rather be a small fish in a big sea or a big fish in a small sea? And he decided on the latter. He felt it would have more of an impact here in Arlington than his collections than they would in Austin. And I think he's absolutely right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So back to the 1997 maps. We talked about the atlases.
Yeah.
What about there were maps and there were textbooks?
Mainly, no, the textbooks, the geographies came in the 1990 with atlases and geographies.
Okay.
And these textbooks are really quite interesting too. UTA has probably the largest collection of geographical textbooks. And these are 19th century textbooks that students were using in the classrooms, learning the geography of the United States as the United States was expanding westward from the east all the way through Manifest Destiny in the West Coast. And they're fascinating. The maps in these textbooks are fascinating. And we've also added, UTA Special Collections added a significant collection of textbooks, geographies, to complement Mrs. Garrett's. And we bought them from a book dealer out of Halls, Tennessee. And we added about 300 more. So that's a significant collection. But those came in 1990.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So her collection, her map collection, there are about 900 pieces in her map collection. Dorothy Sloan, who was probably the most prominent book dealer in Texas at the time, appraised her collection for a little less than $1 million at that particular time in the early 90s. And Mrs. Garrett's collection kind of focused on what I said. First, Texas, and then beyond Texas, the Gulf of Mexico. Beyond the Gulf of Mexico, the Western Hemisphere, or North America, and then the Western Hemisphere, and then the world. But the strength of her collection, in my opinion, is the Texas part of the collection as well as the Gulf of Mexico. And then she ended up broadening her collection to include the leading cartographers of going back to the 1500s, to be honest, that depict that Gulf of Mexico region first, and then ultimately Texas as a political entity. And probably the most valuable, I don't know if I should say this, but by far the most valuable map in her collection is a Stephen F. Austin map of Texas that dates from 1836, that was printed in Philadelphia in the United States by the Tanner Company. And I was with Mr. Garrett when he purchased that map in an auction at the Texas State Historical Association. They have these auctions every year. And I know it hurt him, but he ended up paying like $22,000 for that map, and that was in the 80s. So that map's well over $100,000 now. It's a wonderful piece, too. So her collection is very diverse, but it has a focus, and those cartographers are very important.
Was there anything that that they had that they wanted to donate that we didn't necessarily want?
Not in the book and manuscript collection. I only laugh because Mr. Gerald always threatened me. He collected barbed wire, too. And he had reams of barbed wire in his garage. And he used to say, Gerald, if you don't take the maps, you don't get the barbed wire. And if you do take the maps, you're going to have to take the barbed wire. And I said, oh, Mr. Gerald, please don't give us the barbed wire. And luckily, he was kind enough not to give us the barbed wire. And I think they ended up at the Fort Worth Museum of Science and History.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, people...
Oh, actually, I've seen them, come to think of it.
Yeah, and there are hundreds of different types of barbed. Yeah, I didn't know this. But, Mr. Garrett was an inveterate collector. He always said he was infected by the collecting bug. He said, Gerald, I always divided my collecting into three periods. There was a mild period, an aggressive period, and then there was a compulsive period. And it was the compulsive period that he started collecting barbed wire and postcards and everything else.
But rolls and rolls of barbed wire,
rolls.
not just...
Yes, rolls. Well, he had both. He had rolls, and then he had
strands or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So what items from the Garrett collection did you use in your coursework?
Oh, gosh. I used a ton of maps. Mentioned the Stephen F. Austin maps. There are a lot of significant Texas maps that I used in my Texas history class. Plus, I used a lot of broadsides from Mr. Garrett's. They called it the, quote, original gift the 1974 gift. He had one of the original copies of the Texas Declaration of Independence that had been printed shortly after March the 2nd, 1836. He had broadsides, or essentially posters, of kind of the Texas interim government printed posters trying to encourage people to join. You know, Uncle Sam wants you, well, the Texas government needs you, and these are to arms, you know, the Mexicans are coming in, we need defense. Right. So I used a lot of those things. And newspapers that he had, the first one that showed the Alamo had fallen, and that was like March 26, 1836, the newspaper of the Texas Telegraph and Texas Register. And it's the first entry that talks about the Alamo, and it was preliminary information. And so I've used that as well. And of course, photographs that are from his collection, postcards from his collection I used. He became a very active postcard collector too. So, you know, once you get into the late 19th and particularly the early 20th century and beyond, there are great illustrations that you can see on postcards. He has had over 1,000 postcards.
What kind of postcards?
Well, just city views, street scenes, buildings.
Welcome to Miami.
Yes. Well, it's kind of like that later. But, you know, keep in mind the penny press, postcards cost a penny at that time. And a lot of these postcards have notations on them, or letters on the back, and saying, you know, we're enjoying our stay here in Cut and Shoot, Texas, or we're enjoying our stay in Fate, Texas, or Erath County. And not only they're illustrative, but the information on a lot of these postcards is very interesting. Yeah. So they show virtually everything: schools, street scenes, buildings that are important, hospitals, universities. They're very important.
When did the Garrett lecture series begin, and what were the goals of that lecture series?
Well, the lecture series began shortly after Mrs. Garrett donated her map collection in the map collection was donated in 97. We had a huge public kind of coming out party in 1998. The chancellor of the UT system, all the Garrett friends, there were probably 250 people there. When the university accepted her map collection, they accepted it under a couple of conditions. Number one was the university would raise an endowment to support the map collection, an endowment that equaled the value of the map collection at that particular time, and that fell on me to do. But, you know, when the Garretts are around, they could always help. And you knock on doors and say, you know, Virginia and Jenkins Garrett, doors open for you. And that helps. And the UT system helped too. And the UTA development office helped too. So that was an effort that took about a year and a half. But we raised about $1 million for an endowment to support the collection. That was one thing. Second thing was they wanted the collection to be used. And so the history department stepped up and decided it was going to create an endowed chair on the history of cartography. And the Sid Richardson Foundation, again, that helped support the beginnings of the map collection, that donated money as we were building this endowment, also stepped up to help support the history department in building a cartographic history chair. That was only the second one in the world. So UTA is one of two. I'm not even sure the first one is in Utrecht, I think. It still exists, but UTAs exist. And then the Center for Greater Southwestern Studies, that actually existed before Mrs. Garrett's 1997 collection. But they loved that kind of synergy. You know, you have an endowed chair to make sure that it's being taught, the maps are being taught. You have the Center for Southwestern Studies that are doing promotional programs, lecture series. And then you had the library with an endowment, and that endowment was to do a couple of things. One was outreach, and we felt the best thing to do for outreach was a lecture series. And the first lecture series focused on soldiers and engineers in the Southwest, and we ended up publishing the papers, I was one of the speakers in that. Dennis Reinhardt's was another speaker. David Busseret was yet another speaker. So that was the first. And I think, Joe, that was probably about 1998. It may have been 99. And then every other year, that endowment supports the endowment. The endowment supports the biennial Garrett lectures. It supports additions to the map collection, and it also supports preservation of the collection to make sure that these maps are being preserved.
So what collaborations around the lecture series were most significant, and which ones raised the profile of UTA as an institution?
Well, I think probably the most important, I'm not sure I'd call it a collaboration, was that the publication of some of the early lecture series that widens your reach. Not only can the people who don't attend, they can at least have access to the papers. And it's kind of like the web lectures that the UT Department of History does. So I think the publications, and most recently, I think a lot of the exhibits that are mounted to interact and integrate into the lecture series are online, and they exist beyond the lecture series, and they exist beyond the time period that they're physically up. And so I think those are probably the two most important things that have helped the lecture series become very well known. I think Dennis Reinhardt's last week when we were talking at that program for Dianne said that the UTA Special Collections is probably better known outside of Arlington and Texas than it is inside of Texas, because of things like the lecture series, things like the exhibits that enhance the lecture series, and people have access to those things.
Who is Dianne Powell?
Well, Dianne Powell is the oldest child of the Garretts. She was born in 1943 while they were on the West Coast in California, and she had a sister, Donna, who was born in 1945, and then Jenkins Garrett Jr. was born in 47. But Donna and Jinx were born in Texas when the Garretts had returned. So Dianne, I probably met Dianne in 1987, shortly after I came to UTA. And Dianne was a spark plug. I mean, she was kind of like the Energizer Bunny. And she was very much interested in maps, and I think for some of the same reasons Mrs. Garrett was. Dianne saw maps artistically, but also she saw them as having significant historical, cultural, scientific information that they reflected. And so Dianne spent some time at the Library of Congress, as did Donna, in internships at the Library of Congress during the summer, and got to know maps and got to work with maps from the Library of Congress. And I think that sparked an interest in Dianne. And in some ways, Dianne's map collection that she donated to UTA reminds me of a lot of Mrs. Garrett's map collection, because if you look at it, some of the same themes are represented. There are Texas maps in her collection. There are maps of the Gulf of Mexico in her collection. There are maps of the world in her collection. And then there's some cartographic, I'll call them, to me, oddities. And, you know, they're just like a page from an atlas that must have caught Dianne's attention. I don't know why it caught Dianne's attention, but it did. And I think some of these things actually reflected where she and her husband, Boone Powell, may have traveled. So those things ended up in special collections too. There are very few of those, but I think most of the collection really reflects Mrs. Garrett, her mother's interest, and then Dianne just became kind of infatuated with those maps. And you know, and Dennis mentioned this last week in that program too, that during that program when we introduced Mrs. Garrett's map collection in she gave it in 97, it was a big party in 98, and I'd asked Dianne, what did she think about her mother donating the collection? And she essentially said, you know, my mother's donating my legacy, my inheritance to UTA. And in some ways, I think Dianne and Donna and Jinx, you know, and that's exactly what happened. That is what happened. And of course, Dianne was collecting shortly after that.
And she made an additional donation of some antique maps later on. Is that
Absolutely.
correct?
Yes.
And what was that? What were
Well,
those maps?
those were maps of the world. Those were
Okay.
some maps of Texas as well. That's why I say her. If you
So
look,
there were
if you
more
kinda,
maps,
yeah,
is what
yeah,
it was.
I'm aware of about 50 maps that Dianne donated. That's what I'm aware of. There could be many more than that, but her donation happened after I left Special Collections.
Which was what year?
Well, that I left the library.
Do you,
Even after I left the library.
Because you
too.
became the dean of the library in what year?
Yeah, no, this was after Dianne. I stepped down as dean of the library, and let's see, I'd have to figure that one out.
Sorry, didn't
That's
mean
okay.
to put you on the spot. Yeah, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
That's all
there.
right. I don't mind being put on the spot, but I'd have to think back because I was head of special collections in 1986. I became dean of the library in about 2004. And that time, Dianne hadn't donated anything, and even by the time I left, probably left the deanship, she hadn't donated either.
But were you still engaged with the family during that period of time?
Yeah. As a matter
So you'd
of fact,
become a family friend by this time.
Right. Oh, yes. Once you're a friend of the Garretts, you're always a friend of the Garretts. And I'd actually thought about writing a biography of Mr. Gerald. In fact, Dianne always wanted me to, but I never felt comfortable because I didn't think I could be objective about him. Because probably more, other than my father, he probably impacted my life more than anybody else, and my views and attitudes and all of those values and things like that. And so I was always reluctant to say yes to that. I said, Dianne, I will interview your father, and we will have essentially an oral biography of him, and it's in Special Collections. I did 7 interviews with Mr. Gerald. Start from his childhood and worked through to where he was in like 91 is when the last interview was done. He died in 2010.
How long, well, altogether, how many hours of interview do you
Well,
think you
each
did?
one was about an hour and a half. Mhm. They took place in his office. And of course, we have the Garrett manuscript collection too. It's large, as you can imagine. Mr. Garrett was involved in a lot of things, and Mrs. Garrett too. They've won so many different awards, and it's huge. Somebody needs to write his biography, but I don't think I'm the one to do it. I don't think I'd find anything skeletons in his closet, but if I did, I wouldn't want to.
Right.
I wouldn't want to deal with it. To be honest,
I can understand that.
Yeah.
So, what part of the cartographic holdings that UTA has remain underused, or underutilized? In your
I
opinion?
think you'd have to ask the current special collection staff that question. My guess is, and it's only a guess, that the African maps that were recently donated by Dr. Frankie, who was one of Dennis Reinhardt's student, knew the Garretts, are probably underused now, but, tune in. Who knows what's going to happen a year from now. The nice thing about, and he donated hundreds of maps of Africa from all different historical periods, and he's essentially saying this is going to be an interest and a focus of this collection. And as they move it out and make more or add more maps, and Dr. Demhart, who's the endowed shareholder and has done significant work in Africa, I suspect they are used now. I just don't know. From my perspective, that I would say probably the African maps, but that's a hunch.
What do you think UTA ought to collect that would honor the Garretts? What other kind of collections should UTA pursue?
As a former archivist and somebody who's taught archives and has been a director and dean of a library, I think you build on your strengths. And I think those strengths are pretty well established right now. And, Texas is important, cartographic history is important, the history of the U.S.-Mexican War. I mean, we have stellar collections in all of those things. Labor history of Texas is important, and disability history, which is a new collecting area. When I say new, new-ish, certainly new since I left the library. And I think that makes UTA one of the more unique libraries and special collections. not just in Texas, but in the United States, because focusing on people with disabilities and the push for equal rights, I think is a stellar new area to collect in.
So is there anything about the Garretts or Dianne Powell that we haven't discussed that you would like to add?
I can't think of anything now, but that doesn't mean there's not something that we probably should have discussed.
Right. Well, we could do an addendum if
yeah,
we need to.
yeah.
Well, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed.
Well, thank you for interviewing me.
Right.